Some people believe loneliness begins when you're left by someone you love. They're wrong. Real loneliness begins the day you stop believing anyone will come when you call for help. Sometimes it isn't a grand rescue that changes a life. Sometimes it's simply one man kneeling beside a dying mare before sunrise and refusing to leave until both mother and foal are standing. She would later tell people she almost never knocked on his cabin door that morning. That single decision would save far more than a frightened horse. It would awaken hope in a woman who had quietly buried it years before. Some people spend their whole lives believing loneliness arrives the day someone leaves. But the deepest kind of loneliness doesn't begin with goodbye. It begins when you stop expecting anyone to come at all. Out on the Colorado frontier, where mountains swallowed sound and winter erased the narrow wagon trails between neighboring ranches, people learned early that survival often depended on whoever answered a knock at the door before sunrise. Sometimes that knock brought terrible news. Sometimes it brought hope. And sometimes, though no one realized at the time, it brought both. This story began on one of the coldest mornings the valley had seen in years. Long before daylight touched the snow-covered peaks. Long before smoke drifted from stone chimneys. Long before the world seemed ready to wake. Only one cabin showed any sign of life. Nathan Cole's. The little cabin stood alone beside a weather corral, tucked against a grove of wind-bent pine trees that spent decades enduring the same unforgiving winters as the man who lived among them. At 42, Nathan had become something of a quiet mystery to the scattered ranchers throughout the valley. He wasn't unfriendly. He simply spoke only when words carried purpose. He repaired broken fences without being asked, returned wandering cattle before anyone noticed they were missing, stopped to help strangers whose wagon wheels had sunk into spring mud or whose horses had thrown a shoe miles from town. He accepted payment if people insisted. More often, he rode away before anyone had the chance. Some believed he preferred solitude. Others assumed grief had made him hard. The truth was quieter than either rumor. 5 winters earlier, another blizzard had settled across these same mountains. His wife had gone into labor weeks too early. The nearest doctor never reached them. The roads disappeared beneath snowdrifts taller than a man. By the time help finally arrived, there was nothing left to save. The cabin had never felt warm afterward. Nathan continued feeding livestock, repairing barns, breaking horses, planting hay. Life demanded work, whether a heart wished to keep beating or not. So he worked, day after day, season after season, until routine slowly became something resembling survival. Yet every spring, when new foals stumbled awkwardly onto uncertain legs, he found himself lingering a little longer beside the pasture fences, watching fragile new lives discover the world. Perhaps because somewhere beneath years of silence, a small part of him still remembered what hope looked like. He simply no longer believed it belonged to him. Outside, the wind strengthened. Snow hissed across the frozen yard like handfuls of dry sand. Nathan added another log to the stove before settling into the worn wooden chair beside the fire. The kettle had just begun to whisper. Then came the knocking. Not polite, not hesitant, desperate. 3 sharp blows against the cabin door. A pause. Then 3 more. Nathan was already standing before the final knock landed. When he opened the door, the wind burst inside carrying needles of snow. A woman stood on the porch. Her heavy wool coat was dusted white. Dark strands of hair had escaped beneath her hood and clung to her cheeks, damp with melting snow. Her breathing came fast, each breath forming pale clouds in the frozen air. "Nathan Cole," she managed. He gave a single nod. "My mare." She swallowed, fighting for enough breath to continue. "She's foaling." Another breath. "Something's wrong." Nathan looked past her. A saddled horse stood trembling beside the fence, steam rising from its back after a hard ride through the darkness. He noticed the woman's gloves. One was missing. Her fingers had turned nearly white from the cold. He stepped aside. "Come inside." She shook her head immediately. "I can't." Her voice nearly broke. "If I wait, I'll lose her." Nathan never asked unnecessary questions. Instead, he reached for his coat hanging beside the door, pulled on heavy gloves, lifted a weathered leather medical satchel from beneath the table. Its buckles have been repaired so many times they hardly resemble the originals. You rode alone? She nodded. The nearest ranch. She glanced back toward the snow. Is yours? Nathan extinguished the lamp. Within moments, both horses were moving through the darkness. The valley disappeared beneath swirling snow. The moon vanished behind heavy clouds. Even experienced riders struggled to distinguish road from open field. Margaret Ellis rode several yards ahead, turning often to be certain Nathan remained behind her. She had debated making this ride for nearly an hour. Twice she had saddled her horse. Twice she had unsaddled it. Asking for help had become something she no longer knew how to do, not because she lacked pride, because experience had taught her that hope often hurt more than disappointment. 3 years earlier, when her husband Daniel died after being thrown from a frightened horse, neighbors filled her yard for nearly a week. They brought casseroles, cut firewood, promised she would never face the ranch alone. Those promises lasted less than winter. One family became busy with planting. Another welcomed a new baby. Another moved west. Visits became waves from passing wagons, then nods across church aisles. Eventually, nothing. The debts remained. The broken fences remained. The empty house remained. She stopped asking. It hurt less that way. Tonight, though, the Mare had looked at her with frightened eyes, and Margaret realized she wasn't ready to lose one more living thing she loved. Ahead, a lantern appeared. Then another. Her barn. Relief washed across her face for only a heartbeat. Then fear returned. The stable door stood open. Before he could speak again, another sound carried across the frozen yard. Hoofbeats. Steady. Unhurried. Every head turned toward the northern road. A lone rider emerged through the morning mist. Nathan, beside his horse, trotted the missing colt. Its ears stood alert. Its coat shone beneath the pale winter sun. A ripple passed through the crowd. Margaret closed her eyes for a single heartbeat, relief washing over her so suddenly that her knees nearly gave way. Nathan guided the young horse calmly into the yard before dismounting. The colt pressed its nose gently against Margaret's shoulder, as if it had merely wandered a little farther than expected. "You found him," she whispered. Nathan nodded. He was hidden in an abandoned sheep shelter beyond Miller Ridge. She frowned. Hidden? I don't think he wandered there. The words settled heavily over the gathering. Nathan reached into his saddlebag. Instead of drawing out a rope or feed sack, he removed a leather folder worn smooth with age. Then another, and another. Old maps, county surveys, breeding records, letters bearing official seals. The auctioneer looked puzzled. "So what's all this?" Nathan stepped forward. "The reason this sale shouldn't happen." The crowd fell silent. Nathan unfolded the first document across a nearby wagon. This mare descends from the Ashwood line. Several older ranchers exchanged surprised glances. One of them stepped closer. "I haven't heard that name in 20 years. Nathan nodded. "Most people haven't." He pointed toward the colt. This bloodline nearly disappeared after the drought of 71. He carefully placed another certificate beside the first. The colt isn't an ordinary ranch horse. He represents one of the last documented descendants. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Mercer stepped forward, his expression carefully controlled. "Interesting history." He smiled politely. "But sentimental value doesn't settle debt." Nathan looked at him calmly. "No, it doesn't." He opened the final survey. "This does." The faded map showed property lines extending beyond Margaret's existing pasture. Attached to them were recorded grazing rights her late husband had inherited years before, but never formally transferred into ranch's operating records. Nathan spoke quietly, allowing facts to carry their own weight. Those rights remain legally attached to this property. The current valuation submitted for foreclosure ignored them completely. A county clerk accepted the papers. He adjusted his spectacles and studied every page carefully. Minutes passed. No one spoke. Finally, he looked toward the auctioneer. "The appraisal is incomplete." He looked again, then a third time. "The foreclosure cannot proceed under these figures." Mercer's confidence faltered for the first time. "There must be some mistake." "There is," the clerk replied evenly. It wasn't Mrs. Ellis's. Silence spread across the yard. The auctioneer slowly lowered his papers. Today's sale is suspended pending a corrected valuation. No gavel struck. No property changed hands. The ranch remained exactly where it had always been. Only now, it still belonged to Margaret Ellis. She stood motionless, unable to speak. Years of carrying every burden alone seemed to lift all at once. Nathan gathered the scattered documents without triumph. He had not come to defeat anyone. He had simply come prepared. Mercer studied him for a long moment. Then he tipped his hat politely. I misjudged the situation. Nathan answered with a respectful nod. So did a lot of us. Mercer mounted his horse and rode away without another word. Sometimes defeat arrives quietly. Sometimes dignity does too. News traveled quickly across the valley. People who had once assumed Margaret would somehow manage on her own began seeing the truth more clearly. Mrs. Abigail Turner organized neighbors to repair sections of broken fencing before spring thaw. Ben Hawkins arrived with fresh hinges and iron braces of barn doors, refusing payment before Margaret could even offer it. A young family delivered seed for the coming planting season. Another neighbor loaned 2 draft horses for field work. No speeches were made. No one apologized for staying away. Instead, they simply showed up, and sometimes actions become the apology words never quite managed to express. As winter loosened its grip, the valley slowly changed. Snow retreated from the hillsides. Creeks awakened beneath melting ice. Morning birds returned to the cottonwoods surrounding the ranch. The little colt that had once struggled to stand now raced joyfully across green pasture, its long legs carrying it farther each day. Life had found its rhythm again. One warm afternoon, Nathan worked along the western fence, replacing weather rails damaged by the winter storms. Margaret walked toward him, carrying 2 tin cups filled with fresh coffee. She leaned against the newly repaired fence. For a while, neither of them spoke. The colt galloped past, bucking playfully before stopping beside its mother. Margaret smiled. You know, Nathan glanced up. I thought you came because of the mare. He rested the hammer across the fence rail. I did. She raised an eyebrow. For the first hour. A gentle laugh escaped her. The sound surprised them both. Nathan looked across the pasture, where sunlight shimmered against fresh grass. Then I stayed because I realized something. She waited. Some things deserve more than surviving. The words settled softly between them. Not dramatic. Not rehearsed. Simply true. Margaret looked at the fence they now stood beside. Months earlier, every board had leaned at a different angle. Now it stood straight, strong, reliable. She realized the same could be said for her own life. Carefully, almost shyly, she reached for Nathan's hand. He looked down, then intertwined his fingers with hers. Neither hurried to speak. Neither felt the need. Some promises were strongest when made without words. The wind carried the scent of fresh earth across the pasture. The colt burst into another joyful run, circling its mother before disappearing over a gentle rise. Margaret watched until it returned again, fearless now. It doesn't even remember how close it came to dying. Nathan smiled faintly. Maybe that's a gift of being young. She looked at him. And the rest of us? He considered the question. We remember. He squeezed her hand gently. But we don't have to let the hardest winter decide what comes after it. The valley stretched quietly around them. The same mountains remained. The same fences. The same sky. Yet everything felt different. Not because the land had changed. Because the people living on it had. The little foal that had entered the world trembling beneath the dim light of freezing dawn now ran with confidence across open fields. It had become more than a horse. It had become a reminder that fragile beginnings are not signs of weakness, that hope often arrives quietly, and that the strongest lives are rarely built by dramatic moment alone, but by ordinary acts of steadfast care repeated day after day. Some stories are remembered for their battles, others for their victories. But the ones that linger longest in the heart are often about the people who answered a desperate knock before sunrise, stayed long after the hardest work was done, and taught someone, without ever saying the words, that they were never meant to face the next winter alone. The frontier had a way of measuring people that no courtroom or town council ever could. It cared nothing for reputation, nothing for wealth, nothing for promises spoken over polished tables. Out here, a person's character was revealed in smaller ways. In whether they stopped to mend a broken fence that wasn't theirs. In whether they shared hay during a hard winter. In whether they came back after saying they would. Nathan Cole returned. Not once, not twice, but often enough that Margaret Ellis eventually stopped being surprised when she spotted his horse crossing the ridge beyond her pasture. He always arrived with a reason, never an excuse, never an obligation. The first visit came 3 mornings after the foal was born. Nathan knelt beside the young colt, gently running practice hands along its legs, checking each joint as it wobbled uncertainly across fresh straw. "Strong," he said quietly. Margaret folded her arms. "You rode 5 miles just to tell me that?" Nathan shrugged. "I was passing through." She looked toward the empty valley stretching beyond the barn. There wasn't another ranch for miles in the direction he'd come from. "You weren't." A faint smile touched one corner of Nathan's mouth. "No." He reached down, brushing a handful of loose straw from the foal's shoulder before standing. "I wasn't." It was the closest thing to an admission either of them made. Yet somehow it was enough. As winter settled deeper across the valley, those visits became part of an unspoken routine. One afternoon he found the paddock gate hanging crooked after heavy winds twisted its hinges. Margaret emerged from the stable carrying a hammer. "I'll get to it." Nathan examined the split post. "I know." Without another word, he removed his coat, set over the fence rail, and began replacing the broken timber. Margaret sighed. "You don't have to keep fixing everything." Nathan continued working. "I'm fixing a gate." She watched him for a long moment. "You know that's not what I mean." He drove another nail into place before finally looking up. "No." His voice remained calm. "But it's what I'm doing." She couldn't argue with that, so she didn't. Instead, she carried over another box of nails and quietly held the post steady while he worked. Neither noticed that they had begun moving together with the easy rhythm of people who trusted each other's hands long before trusting each other's hearts. Weeks passed. Snow climbed higher against the fences. The foal grew stronger with each passing day, its uncertain steps giving way to playful bursts across the frozen pasture whenever the sun briefly appeared. Mrs. Abigail Turner noticed. She noticed Nathan's horse tied outside Margaret's barn more often. She noticed laughter drifting across the yard once or twice, a sound so unfamiliar from that ranch it made her pause while hanging laundry. She never mentioned it. Small communities often understood that the most important changes happened quietly. Margaret still resisted every kindness. When Nathan arrived with 2 extra sacks of oats, she frowned. "I didn't order feed." "I know." "Then where did it come from?" "I had more than I needed." She studied him carefully. "You bought this." Nathan adjusted the sack onto his shoulder. "The horses won't ask where it came from. They might if they knew how stubborn their owner was." She almost smiled. Almost. But years of disappointment were not undone in a single winter. Hope remained something she handled carefully, like thin ice over deep water. One afternoon, while repairing loose board along the stable wall before another storm, Nathan noticed Margaret standing unusually still beside the empty horse stalls. There had once been more animals here. The worn marks on the floor made that obvious. He rested his hammer. "How many?" She didn't ask what he meant. 17. Her answer came softly. "When Daniel was alive." Nathan waited. "I sold the first 3 to pay funeral expenses." A pause. "The next 5 bought seed." Another pause. "The rest." She looked away. "Kept the bank from taking the ranch that year." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Simply honest. "The mare?" Nathan finally asked. Margaret glanced toward the pasture, where the foal chased drifting snowflakes. "She was the one horse I couldn't sell." "Why?" "She was Daniel's favorite." Her voice nearly disappeared. "And because somewhere deep down," she laughed bitterly, "I believe she might save us someday." Nathan understood more than she realized. Not because of horses, because grief often attached itself to ordinary things. A saddle, a blanket, a photograph, a favorite mug left untouched on a shelf. Sometimes letting go of those things felt too much like letting go of the person who had once loved them. I used to keep my daughter's little boots by the fireplace, he said quietly. Margaret turned toward him. They didn't fit anyone. They never would. He rested both hands on the fence rail. I couldn't move them. The wind stirred loose snow across the yard. It wasn't because I thought she'd come back. His eyes remained fixed on the distant mountains. It was because putting them away felt like admitting the world had become exactly the place I feared it had. Margaret said nothing. Neither did Nathan. Some conversations needed silence more than answers. By early February, another visitor began appearing at the ranch. Unlike Nathan, Elias Mercer never arrived carrying tools. He arrived carrying numbers, contracts, predictions, practical advice. His coat was always immaculate. His boots rarely touched mud. He removed his gloves carefully before speaking. Mrs. Ellis. She remained standing in the doorway. What brings you here? I've come to make a generous offer. I've heard generous offers before. This one could spare you a great deal of hardship. He unfolded a document. The ranch. She didn't take the paper. I'm not selling. You should. His tone remained courteous. The winter has already beaten you. It hasn't. It will. He glanced toward the stable. Animals die. Debts grow. The bank is patient. But not forever. Margaret met his eyes. I'm staying. Mercer sighed. I admire determination. A pause. But determination doesn't pay interest. Before leaving, his gaze settled briefly on the young foal racing through the snow. A remarkable colt. Margaret instinctively stepped between Mercer and the pasture. He noticed. So do buyers. When he rode away, the valley somehow felt colder than before. The weeks that followed became harder. Letters arrived more frequently. Official stamps. Red seals. Warnings. Deadlines. Nathan never asked to read them, but he saw the strain settling across Margaret's face each time another envelope appeared beneath the door. Then came the second great storm. It arrived after sunset without warning. The wind struck first, then snow, heavy, blinding, relentless. The old stable groaned beneath the weight gathering on its roof. Nathan reached the ranch just as one corner beam cracked. Together they rushed the horses outside. The frightened mare escaped into the white darkness. The foal followed. Nathan, Margaret shouted into wind. It went over the ridge. Lanterns barely pierced the swirling snow. Every track disappeared moments after it formed. Hour after hour they searched, calling, listening, praying for an answering whinny. At last, a faint cry drifted upward from below. Nathan raised his lantern over the edge of a narrow ravine. There, the foal stood trapped among rocks, shivering but alive. Nathan climbed carefully down the icy slope, while Margaret steadied the rope from above. For one terrible moment his footing slipped. The lantern swung wildly. Snow tumbled into darkness. Then his hand found the frightened colt. Easy now. You're coming home. Minutes later, horse and man climbed back onto solid ground. Margaret wrapped both arms around a trembling foal. Relief burst from her in a laugh so unexpected it startled even her. It mingled with tears that refused to stop. Nathan watched quietly. Winter had taken much from this woman. Tonight, it hadn't won. The next morning, while repairing storm damage, Nathan discovered something tucked inside an old storage chest beneath brittle maps and faded correspondence. Original breeding certificates. Bloodline records dating back decades. Carefully preserved. He carried them home without saying a word. Over the following days, he visited the county archives, spoke with retired ranchers, compared forgotten land surveys, and copied fragile legal filings by lamplight. Each discovery pointed toward the same astonishing truth. The mare's bloodline was exceptionally rare. The colt represented generations of valuable breeding stock. And Daniel Ellis had owned overlooked grazing rights attached to the ranch, rights no creditor had included in their calculations. Nathan said nothing. Not yet. Some truths became stronger when supported by evidence rather than hope. But while he gathered proof, Elias Mercer made his move. The foreclosure notice arrived on a gray morning. The auction date was set. 3 weeks. No extensions. No appeals. Margaret sat at the kitchen table long after the messenger left. Nathan found her there at dusk. She didn't look up. "I think." Her voice broke. "I'm tired." He remained standing. "I'm tired of fighting people who already decided I lost." The room fell silent. Outside, snow slipped softly from the roof. Nathan finally spoke. His voice was low enough that she almost missed the words. "Winter only wins when good people stop believing spring is coming." Margaret closed her eyes. For several moments, she said nothing. Then she reached for the foreclosure notice. Instead of folding it away, she laid it flat, smoothed every crease, and whispered, "Then I suppose we'd better make it to spring." Hope returned quietly, but it returned. Neither of them realized someone else had been watching the ranch from the distant tree line. The evening before the auction, the valley settled into an uneasy silence. During the night, a pasture gate swung slowly open. By dawn, the young colt was gone, and with it disappeared the one living promise that might have saved everything.